Hello and welcome to All About Autism. I'm Lea Hill, the host of this series, which will cover all aspects of autism from the inner depths to the outer limits. This is the very first episode of All About Autism, and in this show I'll be explaining what autism is, how it affects people who have it, and how it affects all of us, the rest of us in the community. And then I'll be describing some of the upcoming show topics that will be covered in future episodes of All About Autism. But first, I'll give you a little bit of background about me, who I am, and why I'm here doing this show. I have an image of myself with a person with autism that I had worked with and volunteered with because I am an autism advocate, and I've spent many years working, speaking, and volunteering in the autism community. I have an MBA at Northeastern University, and I'm also a teacher at North Shore Community College in a program called Bridge to the Future. I also have the homepage of North Shore Community College here as well that you can take a look at, because this Bridge to the Future program is very important for people with intellectual disabilities in the 18 to 26-year-old age range, and it helps them prepare for college planning, career planning, and independent living. Students in this program learn things like social skills for the workplace, computer skills, and transitioning to independence. It's a really great program. And we only accept 15 students a year. So if you know someone who might be interested in applying for this program, check that out on the North Shore Community College homepage website and just put in a search for Bridge to the Future and you'll get all of the information there. Now, I'm also an intuitive medium, and part of what I do is I help people in the autism community, whether it's families, people on the spectrum, as well as educators and clinicians in the community, help to connect with people on the autism spectrum in a very heart-centered and compassionate way. I've also written a novel called The Society of Sylphs. And here's an image of a boy on the beach, which represents the character, Eddie, who is a 12-year-old nonverbal boy with autism who is struggling to be heard. And the book is called The Society of Sylphs, and it's spelled S-Y-L-P-H, because sylphs are fairies of the air, or elemental beings of the air. So Eddie, this young boy who cannot communicate verbally and also has trouble communicating with his body motions or even expressing himself, can communicate with this sylph, this young sylph named Lorana. And they help each other overcome tragedy, they become friends, and they both learn how to express themselves in a society where it's very difficult to be understood. If you're interested in checking this book out, you can go to Amazon.com and right in the Kindle store. I have here's the book cover right here, and it has the clouds on it because sylphs, I believe, live in the clouds as well. And you can check this book out in the Kindle store just by doing a search of the Society of Sylphs or Lea M. Hill. So let's first talk about what autism is. Autism spectrum disorders, or ASDs as they're known as, are a group of disabilities. They're developmental disabilities that can cause significant challenges, social challenges, communication challenges, and behavioral challenges for the person who has it. And evidence of ASD is typically observed when a child is about 3 to 4 years old, although there is a lot of research being done today to help diagnosis to be available much younger and much sooner in a child. And the reason that's important, and I have a picture of a child here, a little girl next to a tree who just looks like she's hiding next to the tree, but she's a really cute little girl. And it's important to diagnose autism early because early intervention with therapies and treatments have been proven to dramatically improve the outcomes of a child with ASD as he or she grows up. Now, there's no known cure for autism, but there are many different types of treatments and therapies that have been shown to be effective and promising for all different ranges of the spectrum. Now, chances are, probably 20 years ago, you never heard of autism, or maybe you didn't even know who had it or anyone who had it or what it was. But the disorder has become so prevalent that most people nowadays either know someone who is on the spectrum or they know a family member of someone who is on the spectrum. And according to the Centers for Disease and Control, the CDC as it's known, and I have the homepage of the CDC here on the screen. According to the CDC, back in 1987, autism spectrum disorders occurred once in every 10,000 people. But now, that's as of 2007, it occurs in 1 in every 88 children in the United States who are diagnosed with autism. So the prevalence of this disorder is approaching epidemic proportions, and it's increasing by 10% every year, and diagnosis is 4 times more likely in boys than in girls. So autism being a spectrum disorder means that there is a wide range of symptoms, of challenges, of what we call abilities or disabilities across this wide spectrum, which means within ASD there are a lot of different diagnoses or labels that can be encompassed within that. And the range, typically what we call, we use the words low functioning and high functioning now. I'm not sure that's really the best words to use, but for right now, until we come up with something better, we consider it a spectrum from low functioning to very high functioning. So someone in this spectrum might be diagnosed with simply autism. Someone else might be diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, which is considered in the higher functioning range. And someone else might be considered what's called PDD-NOS, which stands for Pervasive Developmental Disorder Not Otherwise Specified. I think that means they don't have another label for it, so they call it PDD-NOS. But either way, those are a lot of the terms that we hear within that autism spectrum. And typically, autism also comes in combination with other issues as well. Many people on the autism spectrum also struggle with things like ADD or ADHD or OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. They might have things like seizure or trouble controlling their body movements. So there are a whole range of issues that come along with autism and the autism spectrum disorders. Now let's first talk about how autism affects people who have it. Every person on the autism spectrum is different, and that's what makes it so confusing to deal with and why there is no known cure for autism, because every single person is different. So there's no one treatment or one therapy that has been proven to work for everyone. So first of all, I have an image here of a couple of kids playing out in the field, just socializing and interacting. And let me give you a list of some of the ways that autism affects people who have it. First of all, it affects people's perceptions. So people on the autism spectrum tend to be very literal. They take things very literally. And what that means is if you were to say something like, oh, I'm nervous, I have butterflies in my stomach, the person with autism might have a very different reaction to that than you might expect, because they think very literally. So they might even be visualizing butterflies in your stomach. And people on the spectrum also tend to be very visual thinkers. They can walk into a room and see everything at once, where the rest of us, and sometimes we're called neurotypicals, which are people who don't have autism, can walk into a room and focus on 1 or 2, 3, or a couple of things at once that we see when we walk into a room. A person with autism might see everything at once. So the perceptions of someone with autism is very different for us. Also, autism affects social skills. Now, someone with autism might not pick up on those nonverbal cues that you and I understand throughout society, and especially involving something like eye contact. People on the autism spectrum tend to have trouble maintaining eye contact in a conversation. So let's say, for example, you're crying and you're upset. Someone, I might come along and say, oh, I feel bad. I might put my hand on your hand and, I hope you're okay, and show love or compassion, where someone on the autism spectrum might not understand your facial expressions of what sadness looks like and may not be able to respond in the way that we are used to in our society. Another common challenge that people with autism tend to have is repetitive behavior. So people with autism might repeat the same phrase or the same word over and over and over again and not be able to stop. Or they might be making consistent body movements where they are not able to stop that as well. So repetitive behavior is also very common. Also, some people on the spectrum have uncontrollable body movements, which we call, in autism, we call it stimming. And it's interesting because you and I probably do a lot of stimming throughout the day, or at times when we're nervous, just naturally. So we might have a pen and be flicking our pen around or shaking our leg if we're nervous, or kind of bouncing up and down. We typically don't call that stimming, but in the autism community we call it stimming because the person is doing that to release excess energy, or sometimes maybe even just flapping their hands really fast. It's a very effective way for someone with autism to release excess energy when they're nervous or excited. It's just that we call it stimming, where for us, if we're doing that, we could stop it when we need to, but sometimes a person with autism can't stop it. It's more uncontrolled. And people with autism also tend to have trouble adjusting to change. And this can be any kind of change. This can be things like new teachers, new doctors, even trying new types of food can be very disturbing and very difficult, and sometimes even traumatic for someone with autism. So change is very difficult. People with autism tend to like a lot of structure, and it makes them feel, I think, like they have more control, that things that are happening suddenly or sudden movements kind of will make them nervous or a little bit put off a little bit. So adjusting to change is very difficult for someone on the autism spectrum. Hypersensitivity is another very common issue with autism, and that's hypersensitivity to a lot of different things. But first of all, mainly it's hypersensitivity to light. So someone with autism might walk into a very bright supermarket with a lot of lights on and just feel like it's just too overwhelming. It's too much coming at them at once. Again, remember that they tend to be very visual thinkers, so walking into a situation like that with really bright lights might be very disturbing for someone on the autism spectrum. The other thing is sensitivity to sound. So sound, which can be sudden sounds or loud noises, even something like a loud restaurant, can be very disturbing for someone with autism as well. I have seen it where people on the autism spectrum just cover their ears and kind of shrink, kind of the way we would if we were expecting a fire alarm to go off or something. It can be very disturbing, and where they have to withdraw from the situation. Another type of hypersensitivity, which is a little bit more difficult sometimes for the rest of us to understand, that's sensitivity to touch. For some people on the autism spectrum, even just a very light, gentle touch can be very difficult and even sometimes painful for someone on the spectrum. And I'm not sure why. It might have something to do with their nerves or their nervous system, but just I wanted to mention that so that you're aware of that, because our society also tends to be kind of affectionate. I'm a person who always hugs people. I hug everybody, and I go up and hug people, and I have to really be careful and realize if I'm working with someone or I'm around someone who's on the autism spectrum, that I really need to make sure that that person is comfortable with being hugged first or touched first before I do that. So what I also wanted to do now is just go over some things that would help us, the rest of us, think about how we as a society think about people on the autism spectrum. Because our society, as we know, tends to judge people by outward appearances. We just look at someone, we say we judge a book by its cover, and we make judgments about that person. So first of all, what I wanted to mention with autism is, because it is a developmental disorder, it is not necessarily it is not a physical disability, and it might not have anything to do with physical disabilities. And what that means is you can't tell that someone has it just by looking at that person. So we tend to judge people and assume that just because someone looks like us or looks in a way that we expect a certain behavior or reaction from that person. So just keep in mind that autism is not something that you can see, but being aware that there are you might get different reactions from people that you don't expect because they have autism, and you just didn't know that by looking at someone. The other thing is that people with autism are sometimes judged as being crazy or out of control, and that's because sometimes people with autism, because they have sensitivity to sound, they might talk louder, or they might sound like they're yelling when they're really talking. And in our society and in public, if we see someone in a mall who's yelling in the hallway or something, we get nervous. That brings out our fears. So we've even had situations like that at the school, where sometimes someone is just, with autism, is in the hallway, might be upset or angry and is acting very loud, and people get scared and call the police. Not that it's the wrong thing to do, it is the right thing to do, but it's just something to think about, that this person doesn't mean that this person is crazy or out of control. It might just mean that this is a way that this person has to deal with all of that energy in their body, that yelling might be the way to do that or to handle that. The other thing, because of autistic behaviors, is some of us tend to think that people with autism might be rude, or they're not listening to us, or they're not understanding what we're saying. And that's because of a couple of reasons. First of all, we are used to that eye contact. When we talk to people, we are used to having a conversation and having a certain amount of eye contact. And if you were talking to me and I suddenly looked away or looked towards the door, you might say, oh, she just redirected her attention. She's not listening to me anymore. She's watching who's coming in the door. Well, that's probably true, but that's not necessarily true with someone on the autism spectrum. So just because someone is not looking at you in the eyes or doesn't appear to be paying attention, it doesn't mean that that's the case. In fact, I find in the people on the spectrum that I work with that they have a much better sense of what's going on around them than we even realize, and that we notice ourselves. And also, we tend to think of someone on the autism spectrum as aloof, or maybe not caring, or not being able to express feelings or really understand what we're feeling. And that might have to do with, again, hypersensitivity to light, sound, or touch. And it doesn't have anything to do with that person's feelings inside. I get very upset when I hear references to people with autism not having feelings or not having sensitivity. And that, I believe, is completely untrue. I believe that people on the spectrum have all the feelings that we do, and maybe even more, because they are so hypersensitive. It's just that they don't express them the same way that we do. So I have a picture now of a boy in a meadow that you can take a look at. And I like this picture because he looks like he's having a good time, and he's what we might call in his own little world. And that's also a typical judgment that I see that we have as a society about people with autism. Again, going back to that eye contact, someone with autism might have eye contact with you for a very few seconds and then be looking off somewhere into what we call outer space. And we tend to think, again, that that person is not paying attention to us, is not listening to us, but I believe that that is not the case. I believe that someone with autism is seeing everything, is hearing everything, and is feeling everything, and probably understanding exactly what's going on. It's just that hypersensitivity, again, the overwhelmment of all of that information coming in at once is a lot. Especially, as you know, when you're looking in someone's eyes, they are the windows to the soul. So you really do get a lot of information and a lot of feeling from someone just by doing that. So when someone's sort of, we say, in their own little world or checking out, it doesn't mean that that's the case, even though it might appear to be the case, that there are a lot of other things that could be going on as well. So why should the rest of us even know about autism? Let's say you're watching this show right now and you don't have a child on the autism spectrum. Why should you even care? Why should you do anything about it? Well, there's a couple of reasons why you might want to know more about autism and at least have some awareness of what it is and how it affects people. And number one reason is just because of the sheer prevalence of the disorder. That, again, going to 1 in every 88 children in the United States being diagnosed with autism now, and that's considering children. That's before they've even grown up. We already have a large number of adults on the spectrum that are, doing things like, looking for careers, looking for, jobs, entering the workforce, looking for housing, all of the things that we do. These people on the spectrum are doing that now as well. So just the prevalence of the disorder means that if you don't already, you're probably very soon going to meet or know someone or interact with someone who's on the spectrum. And the other thing is, no one really knows why the prevalence of autism has increased so much and why it's increasing by almost 10% a year. And some people guess that it's because the diagnosis is different, that because 20 or 30 years ago, a child might have been diagnosed with something like, say, mental retardation. Now it's being recategorized or re-diagnosed as autism. So that's something to think about as well, is just that the sheer amount of diagnosis, which is not just based on the new factors of what autism is or the criteria. It could also be an increase in diagnosis from something that would have been diagnosed as something else earlier. Also, again, to think about the population of adults that are on the spectrum. So all these children, these 1 in 88 children that are now being born and that are young children that have all of these resources and special skills and therapies and treatments are growing into adulthood. So we are going to be interacting with many, many people on the autism spectrum as they enter the workforce, as they require housing, as they move into independent living. So again, it's all around us. It's something that our society has to take into account. And actually right here in Massachusetts, we already have a housing crisis for people on the autism spectrum. And that's before, that's just based on, people who are in their 20s and 30s right now. That's before this huge diagnosis that's been increasing and increasing in the last 10 to 20 years. We already are in a very crisis situation with finding and funding housing for people on the spectrum. And also thinking about the interaction that you have everywhere with people on the spectrum. This could be anywhere in public, in the mall, at a concert, in the doctor's office, in schools, a lot of different places. So the point is really for you to just be aware of the prevalence of autism. And again, you can't judge someone just by the way they look. You can't tell if someone is on the autism spectrum or not. So just being aware of it, that it's out there and it's very prevalent. But I do want to make note also of the unique contribution that people on the autism spectrum have with our society. Now, some people tend to think of people on the autism spectrum as being savants or very genius, or it means you're good in math, or it means you're great in physics. That's not necessarily true. But I do believe that everyone on the spectrum has a very unique contribution. I've met people on the autism spectrum who are phenomenal artists, who are really good in math, and some that are gentle and sweet and love working with animals and love connecting with other children and love helping people. So you can't really make a generalization about that either. But I do want to bring one very special person to light, and that is Dr. Temple Grandin. I have an image of her as well. If you don't know about Dr. Temple Grandin, I suggest you at least look her up, or if you get a chance to also get the movie that was made about her starring Claire Danes, and I believe it's called Temple Grandin, and it's a great story about her life. And what makes Dr. Temple Grandin so special is that she was the first person with autism to actually be able to explain what it's like and how a person with autism perceives the world, how she processes information, how she can walk into a room or a space and see all these things that you and I don't see because our natural filters filter them out, and we wouldn't see them until we were told to put our attention on something specific. But she walks into a room or a space and sees everything at once. So it's very interesting perspective. Now, she's also a doctor. She's an educator at one of the Midwestern universities, I can't remember which one, and she's in, I think, her late 60s now. She's done a tremendous amount of work for the autism community, and she is still a very active speaker throughout the country as well. She's written probably a dozen books. I recommend reading them because she talks about and explains what it's like to have autism and how she sees things differently than the rest of us. For example, a great example that she gives is when she was a child, she would see a poodle and then she would see a black lab, but would not be able to make the connection that they're both dogs. Okay, so she would see a poodle as something entirely different from a black lab dog, where we see them and notice that they're both dogs because they have 4 legs and a tail, but she wasn't able to make that distinction. So that's a very important, I think, perception indicator that we can be aware of with autism. Another good example she used is when she was given directions to go to drive someplace, and the directions would say take a right at the stop sign. She would follow that, but coming back and reversing the directions, she would get lost because a stop sign from the back looks very different from a stop sign from the front. So coming back and reversing the directions, she wouldn't recognize the same stop sign. So those are just little things to keep in mind about that. Also, Temple Grandin has helped us tremendously in the farming community. She has, by herself, invented and redesigned slaughterhouses for cattle so that they are not put in stress or stressed out before they go to slaughter, that the reactions of the cattle are much more peaceful and calm than they were with other types of systems and units and manufacturing plants that are in the United States today. So she's had a great impact on that as well. So now that you've gotten an idea of what autism is, how prevalent it is in our society, how we tend to judge people with autism, and also their contribution to our society, what I would like to do is continue this series covering a lot of different topics all about autism from all different perspectives. So I'm going to go through now some of the upcoming topics that I have in mind, and I'm definitely open to some of your ideas and feedback as well. So first of all, my overall goal in this show and in this series are actually 3 things. Number 1 is awareness, number 2 is education, and number 3 is resources. So the way I see it is, if you are already on the autism spectrum or you have a child on the autism spectrum, you already have awareness about it. You understand what autism is, you know about it. But if you don't, I want this show to bring to your awareness what autism is and the contributions that people on the spectrum make to our society. Then from that point, once you have awareness, I want the show to also provide education so that you can learn about what it is, about what to do if your child is diagnosed with autism, or what to do about social skills situations and life situations, and education all around all aspects of autism as well. And then finally, I believe once you have the knowledge that you need and the awareness, then we can move on, and we are covering also resources for autism. This would be local resources here in Massachusetts, in addition to internet resources and national resources as well. So the way I see it is, it's a kind of a circle or a cycle, that you have the awareness about autism, what it is, you're educated on how it affects people and how it affects our community, and then you have the resources about how you can help and how you can also get help in our community. And then once you have the resources, it brings you, it like opens your mind, it opens your awareness to all the other things that you need to learn about, which brings you back to the awareness again. So it's sort of a cycle that I've got in mind for this show, covering all 3 of those aspects. And within that, there are a number of topics that I'd like to cover in future shows. Number 1 is certainly public safety, things like police, fire department, hospitals. What kind of training do people in the police department or fire department get about someone with autism? Or in hospitals, how do doctors deal with someone on the autism spectrum? Or what should you as parents do to help and advocate for your child as best that you can? I'll also be covering diagnosis, what to do if your child is diagnosed with autism. What are the first most important things that you need to do right away? And also, how is autism diagnosed? What are the criteria? What are things that therapists and doctors look for when they're diagnosing autism? And then moving into childhood development. So now that your child's been diagnosed, looking at the development of that child and what expectations to have over the coming years until that child reaches adulthood. Also, transition to adulthood is a huge factor. Again, like I said, we have so many children now being diagnosed with autism in our country. Moving into adulthood, we as a society need to figure out how this is going to work and what jobs we can provide for people on the spectrum and how they can contribute to our society as well. Transition to adulthood is a big topic, as well as independent living.